I am missing, and this is actually, I think, relates to my personal background. It relates to the issues that I'm working on. What I'm missing or what I don't find enough explicit in relation to sustainable development goals, and what I feel actually has been sort of being reduced or ignored, is the rights agenda.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce himself. Ed, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Maurice. My name is Ed Schenkenberg. I'm the director sitting in Geneva and the director of a humanitarian think tank called HERE, Humanitarian Evaluation Research Exchange. I'm happy to explain to you and to your listeners, Maurice, what HERE does. We're a small organization. Actually, I must admit, my view is on the lake, so it's quite a convenient environment we're in. But just to say that in that sense, Geneva is a very convenient environment. But in reality, what we are working on as a think tank is what we call the gap between policy and humanitarian practice. So in reality, the issues we work with are much less rosy and much less luxurious than the environment our office is in. Because really what we're concerned about is people affected by crisis and conflict as such, knowing that governments of these countries, international organizations, particularly based in this town, which is one of the reasons why we're based in Geneva, UN organizations, that is, NGOs and so on, have all roles and responsibilities, mandates or missions to address these situations of crisis, and whether they are doing their jobs is exactly what my organization is looking at, in the sense of understanding and reviewing whether the commitments organizations have made are in fact those commitments are in fact part of the work, are addressed by what these organizations are doing on the ground. HERE was created in 2014, precisely because around that time there was talk on, and that, as many of your listeners may know, 2016 was particularly the year in which the World Humanitarian Summit was held. So obviously in those years, part of a development, a huge increase in the attention to humanitarian action, which, you could say generally is a good thing, but obviously there was more attention to it because, in fact, the needs, the number of conflicts, the needs of people affected by these conflicts and so on were increasing, or were also rising exponentially. So, as I said in the beginning, obviously it's a positive thing that organizations, make commitments in relation to the mandates and the missions they have. But then, of course, it becomes important that actually, there is an external eye, so to speak, an observer that actually reviews whether they, what they do, what they preach, whether they actually also practice that. So that is actually what my organization is about since 2014. We're doing this at the request of organizations, so they specifically contract us to do evaluations or to do reviews of their policies and practices. But we can also do this. And this is equally, if not more important, at our own initiative. Obviously, we need to find organizations then willing to work with us. But that degree of independence, of course, being an evaluator, is quite important to have a degree of independence in terms of making, if you like, objective assessments and analyses as to, the challenges, the achievements of organizations, but also their challenges, so to speak. And I think a key word there is, or keywords, I should say, is honesty and trust. So, obviously we need to create trust with organizations to share with us their challenges. That also requires a certain degree of honesty. Obviously organizations often want to show that they're doing good, also under pressure to receive new funds for future operations. So there's a little bit of a reluctance in that sense to be open on one's challenges, so to speak. At the same time, I think there's it goes without saying, there's a moral and ethical obligation really to be open on one's challenges and to say, well, actually there are things we feel we're doing well, but there are also a lot of things that actually we think we should do better. And so organizations seeking advice on how they could address those challenges, I think, is really what's needed. And fortunately, I should say, we see a number of organizations doing so. Those are many of our partners we work with in the UN system, the NGO community, or also on the part of governments, in fact.
I think it's important, and I find it fascinating. I do have a question about, the world has gone through a lot the last 2 years because of COVID. And I think especially for Western countries, maybe they were not used to uncertainty, like, many of
right.
so-called South were used to living, in terms of, I don't know what will happen tomorrow. If you look back at that, what is now the biggest challenge for the NGO sector as a whole, in terms of, its role that it's played before and what it should play today? What are you seeing? What are you observing?
It's a really good and important question, because actually when the pandemic hit, particularly also in Europe, and the US, we had, in fact, as organization, we had very much the feeling this would be or might be a game changer, in the sense of this might actually be a moment in which the humanitarian community, in terms of the way they work, will actually realize we need to work differently. Because the way in which a number of our activities are done may not necessarily be sustainable, or at least we need to reflect on the way we work. And we thought actually the COVID-19 pandemic would be a major trigger in that. Well, I don't want to say it hasn't been a moment for reflection. I think it has for many organizations, but perhaps not in the way we thought it would, actually. Yes, there's a realization in terms of the importance of particularly national and local organizations based in countries in crisis to ensure that they are at the center of humanitarian action and development work in that sense. Yes, there's a reduction. I also see it in my own schedule, a reduction of traveling, for instance, or use of trains instead of taking a flight. But is it fundamental change? I really wonder there as such. Clearly, and I think it's very important to realize that. So what we thought might happen is, in fact, that countries, including in what we call the developed world, would realize their vulnerabilities, would adjust in a way their thinking to the fact that, from one day you can be, in fact, a donor, so to speak, as a country, to the next day, in fact, when you suddenly can become a recipient, if you see what I mean. And to be honest, I think a number of countries realized their vulnerability in certain ways, but I'm not sure they have addressed that in the right way. Because obviously, first of all, in terms of the whole vaccines, it was fending for yourself. Obviously the Western countries, in relation to COVAX and everything, it was, just a question of who has the most purchasing power, who's the quickest in developing effective vaccines and all of that. Mm-hmm. But what is most important, of course, in the whole COVID situation in that sense, is to realize the interdependence and the fact that everything is interconnected in nowadays world in terms of globalization and so on. And yet, and I think one sees this particularly when it comes to forced displacement and so on, the emphasis on national borders, the emphasis on protecting one's own country instead of protecting the world's population, so to speak. Yeah, there's a number of, I would say, reactions on the part of a number of Western governments, at least, that I don't think are very helpful in that sense. So, it's very much a mixed bag, I would say. Both, it has created opportunities and it has created a certain new way of working, I would say. At the same time, I think countries and in our way of working, we also fell back into old habits, if you like. And so that's why I'm saying it's really a mixed bag.
COVID showed us that we are all interdependent, that we should, tackle these problems together. And maybe only, that realization was only there for 2 weeks, and then we went back to business as usual, at least a big part of our world. How are you trying to tackle that within your own organization?
Well, in relation to what I just said, obviously we're trying to change the way in which we work. For instance, obviously, as I said in the beginning, we're an organization based in Geneva. We're very cautious to ensure that we're not ending up in an ivory tower in that sense, and creating our own reality or our own bubble, if you like. Mm-hmm. So we're very much extending, or at least making an effort to try to extend and expand our network of people who do data collection and analysis and research in countries affected by crises as such. So that is one part in terms of, I would say, at least the way in which we work. I think in terms of content, so the issues I would say we all care about, even more than before, I think obviously what has come up is the matter of inequality and double standards and all of that, very, very clearly. And inequality, of course, is a concern to all of us. And as you know, what the pandemic did was emphasizing the existing inequalities even more, so to speak, and making them worse in a way. So, those that were already on the margins of societies, being even worse off, so to speak. So in that sense, I think, we're very, very much concerned about these increased inequalities, so to speak. The way that then relates to humanitarian action, I think, is quite important in the sense of, obviously, one of the principles of humanitarian action is to make sure that those that are worse off, in worse positions, so exactly those that are most affected, either by COVID or by conflict or by climate change, and often, in fact, and what I'm trying to say is, it's compounding these effects, right? It's climate change, it's COVID, it's war, it's human rights violations, all on top of each other, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that actually is a very significant indicator in terms of who is worst affected by crises. So in a time of increased needs and increased inequalities, from a humanitarian point of view, what becomes very important then, there's a focus on those that are exactly most in need, if you see what I mean. So who are most affected by these several crises, one layer on top of each other. And that, it's interesting in that context, Maurice, that So yesterday, was also on the front page of the New York Times for 24 hours at least. The UN launched its biggest ever humanitarian appeal, more than $50 billion. What we know, in fact, is that the gap, so talking again about the gap, so obviously there's the moral, ethical obligation of Western donors, the global community, to deliver the funds that allow these people that are affected by these crises to be assisted. But what we know in reality is that gap is growing between, in fact, the needs that are rising and the available resources. At the moment, it's less than half of the funds that are needed that, in fact, that are provided by donors. That then requires, if I relate this to this point that I made around inequalities and those that are most affected. So from a humanitarian point of view, and this may be a bit of a different perspective than perhaps is seen from the developmental side, but from a humanitarian point of view, priority should go to those most affected, if you see what I mean. So the question, what we're now very interested in as an organization is, in a time of increasing needs, and when resources are maybe going up, but by far not enough. So the gap between available resources and increasing needs is really growing. Our focus then and our interest then is to see how are the humanitarian agencies, the UN agencies and NGOs and so on setting priorities. Because obviously you could say, well, everyone in need deserves assistance. That's true. But as I said, again, this question then, this issue of the principle of those most in need, so it's principle of proportionality, is really then an interesting one to see. So are we most concerned about those who need the assistance most, so to speak?
Thanks, Ed. And I would like to come back to some of those issues that you've raised later in our conversation. I would like to, we understand more about your organization and what is happening. I would like to ask you a couple of questions about you. So how did you get involved in the work that you are doing? And where were you born? And what did you study? And why are you in the place where you are now?
Yeah, that's a really funny question, Maurice, because it puts a smile on my face. Well, it's already now, in fact, quite some time ago. But I was in the fortunate position in my professional life, which now, in fact, I've worked all my life in the humanitarian domain. That's now for 30 years. So says something about my age in that sense. But I was in the fortunate position to have a sabbatical at some point, which part of it I spent in a program on leadership. And in that program, I was actually asked, in a way, the similar question. How did you end up in the humanitarian community world, and what drives you, and all of that?
Yeah.
And I kind of said, wow, this is really by chance. And then when I told the person with whom I was having this conversation, sort of my personal story, he looked at me and said, "You think this is all by chance?" Well, so that is really what puts the smile on my face, because then I sort of realized maybe there was a bit of a conviction there. So let me then explain what this conviction is. And what I tried to explain already in what I said earlier, a lot of the work that I've done throughout my professional career is exactly around rights and obligations in that sense, and accountability. Are governments, are humanitarian organizations, as I said, really doing what they should be doing? And so that element of accountability, I think, has always been, and it certainly relates to injustice and inequality in that sense. I think that has always been a driver in me, so to speak. I think when I was in high school, I wanted to be a journalist. Exactly, there was that already.
Yeah, but why did that not happen? Why didn't you become a journalist?
Well, the journalist didn't happen because, in fact, so there was a school. I mean, obviously, I studied in the Netherlands. I'm originally from the Netherlands, born in Rotterdam. The School for Journalism was oversubscribed. The number of registrations at that time there was oversubscription. Many more interest than people they could put there. Okay, so I thought, no, then I go in university, and especially in those days, if you didn't know what to study and you wanted to take a broad study, I thought, okay, I'll do law. But I was certainly not interested in becoming a lawyer or a barrister or any of that sort. But I was in the fortunate position. I studied international law at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And at that time, in fact, soon after my first general year, I could directly go into international law. And that I thought was very interesting. That really fascinated me. Exactly like I said, the responsibilities and the rights of governments vis-a-vis the citizens in their countries, which is what international law is about. International law, of course, regulates the relations among states for any area of activity that you can imagine. But international law also regulates the relation among states and their citizens, which is precisely called human rights law. And in wartime, in fact, there's also humanitarian law that includes a number of guarantees in terms of the protection of civilians. Now, of course, the whole question is then, to some degree, does international law really exist because there's no international police and all of that? But that exactly fascinated me, because obviously there's a set of behaviors, a set of norms that everyone has to comply with in that sense. So that really got my interest and kept me busy. And in fact, then what happened, and this is where I thought, oh, this is only coincidence. And then people told me, well, we don't think this is so much coincidence. At the end of my study, I needed to deliver, of course, a final thesis. And I thought I had actually done that final year. I had done a moot court competition. So talking about not being a lawyer, in fact, I was playing a lawyer in front of the International Court of Justice. And that question was about humanitarian intervention. And humanitarian intervention is understood as one state entering another state by force to rectify or to correct a human rights situation. So you had these classic situations like Vietnam in Cambodia, to stop the genocide in Cambodia. There were a number of other examples, but every time, of course, what comes up legally there is that there are ulterior motives, so to speak, on the part of the state using force in the other state. So it's never only to rectify a human rights situation, so to speak. And that's then the whole complication around humanitarian intervention, because obviously the use of force is strictly regulated under the UN Charter, only in self-defense as such, or authorized by the United Nations as such. So humanitarian intervention in that sense is a very complicated, where one state invades another state, so to speak, is a very complicated concept under international law. But then I thought, actually, so in the relationship between the state and its citizens, especially when the citizens are in desperate need, because there is an armed conflict or a disaster or another crisis in a country, in human rights texts and treaties, you have the right to life, the right to freedom of movement, the right to assembly, the right to freedom of speech. What do these rights mean, in fact, in such a crisis situation? And is there something like a right to humanitarian assistance? In a sense where a state could claim, or where a citizen could claim from the state, I'm threatened in my survival, I have a right to be assisted. So that was, long story short, that was the topic of my final thesis. And I thought that organizations such as the Red Cross, but also Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, should have an opinion on that. So I interviewed them. And funny enough, and this of course is the history also between the Red Cross and MSF as such, particularly around Nigeria at that time, particularly, this was then late 60s, early 70s. It was particularly MSF, that 5 French doctors that broke out of the Red Cross because precisely they thought this right to humanitarian assistance should prevail in certain situations. So anyway, those were my conversations with MSF and with Red Cross. And the next day I got called by MSF after I had spoken to them if I wanted to work with them. So, long story short, the rest is history, because that indeed was my entry into the world of humanitarian action. And interestingly, this happened all at the time in 1991, when in fact the US-led coalition was forcing Saddam because Saddam in Iraq had taken Kuwait. And of course, there was the international coalition that, went after Saddam and particularly got him out of Kuwait. But then, in fact, what Saddam did in those days, when he was still in power, in fact, he retaliated against the Kurdish population in the north of Iraq. And so then exactly was the question, what can the international community do now? So this whole question of humanitarian intervention or the right to humanitarian assistance, because obviously Saddam was not allowing humanitarian organizations to work with the Kurdish population in northern Iraq. So the question then was exactly, can international military forces provide assistance to the Kurds who were, these communities, you may remember the pictures from those days, in the mountains of Iraq. This was exactly all happening at that time. So it was a very interesting moment when I entered, if you like, my professional career in the humanitarian world.
Yeah, a fascinating story. Thanks for sharing that. I didn't know that story. We did study at the same university, by the way, so we might have met each other on the street from that time.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's cool. Yeah. Hey, you know that this podcast is a spin-off of a 100-mile walk that I've been doing for more than 10 years now, where I try to raise awareness about hunger and poverty and injustice. But then, 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, I was not able to walk with others, and this year also I had to postpone it until March next year because of some personal circumstances. But the question that I always ask to my guest is, if you would be asked to walk 100 miles in a week, so 15 to 20 miles per day, for which cause would you do that, and why?
People who are listening, and maybe Maurice, you may have been, people may have been walking or like to walk, do hikes and so on for much longer than the COVID period. Mm-hmm. Yes, I have done some walks and so on. I mean, particularly in the mountains, of course, as you know, Geneva in Switzerland, so lots of mountains here. But it was particularly the COVID period, the lockdown period, that really gave me the impetus, if you like, to do some walks and so on. So I started really to enjoy walking as well. And then part of one of my responsibilities is, in fact, I'm on the board of a small Dutch NGO, which actually raises funds for refugees. And since 12 years now, should be correct on this, organizes what is called the Night of the Refugee. Mm-hmm. So, which I think is an amazing concept, where exactly, obviously, people, fleeing Syria, Afghanistan, all the crises we know, obviously they are forced to walk. So, in solidarity with these refugees, this organization organizes this Night of the Refugee, where you have to walk 40 kilometers and do as a fundraising tour. Of course, it couldn't happen during the COVID period, but since I had done a bit of walking during those lockdowns, when it was organized again, this time for the first since COVID or since the lockdowns, I decided to participate. And it is, 40 kilometers. I mean, walking 40 kilometers, which I suppose is about 20-something miles, right? Okay, that is doable. But during the night is different. I must say, and doing it with a group of people is different too. The night obviously is a very special moment. It's dark. And although it's done in summer, it's still, that, of course, and this is really done in the countryside. So you can't immediately see the environment, but then gradually, of course, your eyes get used to darkness and you're more able to understand the environment in which you're walking. And, then again, we're doing this in the Netherlands, very safe space. Can you imagine if you have to walk during the night, right? In these faraway countries, insecurity and what have you, as such. But also doing this with a group of people is interesting because for a certain time, you can keep silent. But then also you get to talk with other people, and you start sharing or telling each other stories or, what moves you to be walking there during the night. So that's exactly what happened. I think this is, an extremely good way to show solidarity and to experience a little bit, only a tiny little bit of what refugees have to endure. So it's for me it gave me a huge satisfaction to do this and to show in that sense at least a little bit of solidarity.
Great. Yeah. So you walked, talked, and listened.
So
not
100 miles at once, but
this is
it
great.
was. It was a good talk, a good walk, and actually it took us exactly 8 hours. So the pace was okay, but the last 2 hours were not easy. I can tell you that.
Yeah. No, I can totally relate. Hey, but I find it interesting what you say when you walk with others. It's it gives us a certain you start talking, listening, and all kinds of things happen. What happens during my talks is often we end up talking about spirituality and religion because why are we here on earth? And you walk there, you think like after 6 hours, like why am I doing this? It's the purpose. And then very often we talk about the younger generation. Are they different than our generation? So my question to you is what do you see happening among the youth in your community in relation to spirituality and religion?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I best actually can relate this, I suppose, to my children who are, in their early 20s now. So I would say still youth.
Yeah. Yes.
They see themselves as adults, well, only in age, I would say. But what is so interesting, of course, and we have quite significant discussions on this in the family. And I also see it, in fact, among some of my younger colleagues. Discussions around inequality. And particularly, of course, everything now that's being framed as, woke and or the cancel culture, and I find it fascinating discussions, not easy ones. In Holland, of course, the whole discussion for years, as probably Maurice, has been not only on Sinterklaas, but particularly Black Pete, which obviously is very racist in that sense. So, you could say there are these very obvious sort of examples of things we really need to change into our Western habits or culture. But then I also realize it's probably much more subtle and so on, because actually what is happening with my children is they mention examples and where we get into discussions where initially I think they're quite radical in their position. And then start, forcing me to reflect, like it forces, as I said, things that we developed as standard or so as normal, and I think that's important to say as well. If I take the example of Black Pete, now of course I would say, obviously it's a very racist expression or manifestation. But initially, and certainly not as a child, I would never have made that connection. If you see what I mean, and it's not meant as an excuse. As such, but it's just to state what was the reality, if you see what I mean. But the realities change and perceptions of people change. And I think it's very important. So this is very much in the context of, what I see preoccupies at least, the generation of my children is exactly to challenge, I would say, things, habits and so on that we thought were standard or normal. And sometimes as I said, this feels very inconvenient. And maybe I would say, well, I don't agree with you, and I do say that. But it also, as I said, forces me to reflect.
And how do your children look at religion and spirituality? And is that different than you look at it?
I don't necessarily think so. They may not necessarily, they don't go to a church necessarily or anything like that. But, and we have never asked them to or whatever. But much more, what I think is important, what I do see in them is a recognition, very strong recognition, which I think also relates to, the issues that I just mentioned in terms of challenging us and so on, a deeper belief in humanity and a deeper belief in, the inequalities that you guys created through, it's unbelievable, this discussion in the Netherlands, that whether we have to make apologies for the slave trade and so on. Of course, if we don't apologize for it, it's that the fact that is even a discussion is already strange, right? It's so wrong, if you see what I mean. It doesn't mean necessarily for me that we have to abandon all those statutes or, as happened, but, that you put it in context or that you put a sign with it to explain the context of then and compare that to now, I think is very, very important in that sense. But I think, as I said, it comes, as when I look for my children, from a deeper belief in humanity and the things that are common to all mankind. And I think that for me is a deeper form of belief or religion, if you like.
Let me make a little bridge to the Sustainable Development Goals. And now a group of people within the world is saying that, it's great to have those goals, but because we did not pay attention to, the skills and abilities and knowledge that you need as an individual and as a community, that's why we have difficulties in reaching those goals. And they came up with something that's called the Inner Development Goals. So there are 5 goals that they identified: being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and action. Have you heard about them? And then the second question is, what are your thoughts about that in terms of that we need to pay attention to ourselves, that it requires a mind shift in order to make this world more sustainable and more, equitable?
Let me say 2 things on this. And first, and perhaps I would make myself unpopular by saying this. I'm not sure. It's very interesting to hear you say the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals for my organization, are sort of the benchmarks, or provide really the vision, and they create exactly what we should be aspiring to or what we should work towards. They have never served for me and for my organization in that way. I must say I feel very sort of ambivalent about the Sustainable Development Goals, in the sense, of course, I do not disagree with them. Of course, these are all things that, that need to be done or that should be put in place. But what I am missing, and this is exactly, I think, relates to my personal background, it relates to the issues that I'm working on, what I'm missing in, or what I don't find enough explicit in relation to Sustainable Development Goals, and what I feel actually has been sort of been reduced or ignored, is the rights agenda. For me, inequality, and whether it relates to gender, discrimination, ethnicity, name everything, those issues for me are about the rights agenda. They're all, and that, it goes back to my background, having studied human rights and so on. And I find it very unfortunate that, for me, in that sense, to put it that way, the Sustainable Development Goals are only almost a are almost redundant because we have it in terms of a rights agenda. We have it in terms of the classic sort of individual political rights, but also the socio-economic, cultural rights, and so on. It's all there. We all have already had it in that sense. So I didn't know, or I don't know necessarily what the Sustainable Development Goals added to this. And nowadays, and even yesterday, in relation, in fact, to that appeal from the UN that came out, more than 50 billion needed for next year for humanitarian aid, I saw a declaration from NGOs reinforcing that point, that reinforcing the call, but particularly putting it in the context of what has been called the grand bargain, and what recently has been, trying to address that gap between needs and available resources. And I did a word search in that document, a 5-page document, and because it explicitly mentions the Sustainable Development Goals. But I did a word search on human rights. The word human rights doesn't come up once. It's not mentioned. Women's rights are mentioned a few times, but human rights as such is not mentioned. I mean, then you lose me completely. Because for me, our work has to be based, and you could easily say Sustainable Development Goals are based in rights. Well, I want to make that explicit. Because inequality in the world, I think, has to be addressed through a rights agenda. And yes, that may be very much the lawyer and everything in me, but that for me gives more sort of meaning or content, and it's something I can do something about than necessarily the Sustainable Development Goals, which I find more, well, in a way, too abstract, I suppose. Now, as to your other issue, in the sense of personal behavior and, what one as an individual can do, and how you can reflect, if you like, the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, I'm connecting this to rights. Advancing that rights agenda, or for that matter, if you like, advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, requires leadership. Leadership in the sense of courage, leadership in the sense of taking risk, leadership in terms of bringing others with you, leadership in terms of enabling others to be leaders as well, and empowering the people around you. So I think that what I just mentioned reflects a lot of, or basically may perhaps even all of the inner development goals you just mentioned. It's something I feel very strong about in the sense of what I'm missing. So one of the issues in relation to, as I said, in relation to accountability, which is such a major theme in our work, I would say almost all of our evaluations and reviews that we do, we see leadership as a major issue, where in fact leaders do not or miss a number of these things that I just mentioned, where leaders are just see them as part of the system, and because the system says something else, they will not take risk, or they will not move the issue forward, so to speak. They see themselves, but they don't see their environment. I mean, any of those qualities, or all of these qualities, then are often missed in that sense. And this is interesting. I mean, I'm mentioning this because especially since 2005, 2007, leadership has been a theme in the humanitarian world, put on the agenda also by UN agencies and so on. Well, we're now more than 15 years later, and very little of it has been realized. And perhaps we would not disagree too much, but instead of framing it in the context of Sustainable Development Goals, I'm framing it very much in terms of a rights agenda, and in terms of leaders who move that rights agenda forward. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a real lack of that.
Are you such a leader? And if so, and if not, how do you work? How do you continue to work on yourself?
Well, are you such a leader? It's always hard to say something about yourself. But I do know a little bit what others say about me. And it's I do know a little bit what others say about me, because obviously they ask me to be, a speaker at events, or they ask me for certain things. And one thing I know is at least that, they know me for being outspoken. And maybe that's because I'm Dutch. But I hope it's also exactly because of the kind of the values and the principles that I try to reflect or represent, if you see what I mean. So, in meetings, even official meetings with UN agencies or governments, I will not be shy. And I will ask critical questions in that sense. And so at least that's one way for me to try to advance an agenda. I think, or at least I hope, but I think I've learned to ensure, that, of course, the picture, which is very telling, because part of that sabbatical that I spent on leadership was exactly an exercise, a group exercise, and in the woods, in the forest. And yes, I was out there, meters away from the team that was behind me. Right. What does this tell you? It couldn't be a stronger picture than that, right? So since then, I hope, I think I can say that I've become a leader more to ensure that others around me are able to provide leadership as well. So I don't only see myself anymore. It's already a long time ago now, but I think it's important to mention this, that at least that was a very important realization, right? Yeah, so at least in terms, of course, coming back to practicing what you preach, where we put so much emphasis on certain leadership qualities, of course, it's important that that you also have. One also has, the self-reflection. I mean, good leadership starts with self-reflection. What is it that I do well? What is it that I don't do well? And where really, should and how should I work with others and make sure that I give others a space, so to speak. So yes, at least I'm making an effort, I feel, to be such a leader.
Hey, Ed, I'm going to connect you with another leader who has a question for you.
A question for your next guest for me. Let's see. I think I would want the question to be sort of a specific one. So as you come to the end of the podcast, my question would be, what are the one or two things that have come up just as a result of this podcast, the virtual walk, as you put it, that you would immediately action within your span of possibility and potential that exists with you today? And that's the same thing I would put back to your listeners right now. And I put it back to myself as well, too. With this opportunity, not with what you might know 3 years from now, not with what you might hope for if you studied a bit more, but just from the opportunity of listening and walking together, what would you commit to yourself? Because I think we also need to create those real, practical, beautiful, humble commitments. First and foremost to ourselves. So that's for your listeners,
and that's also for you.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful next question in relation to the conversation where we just were, because in the last several days also, and I think I can tell this now, I'm going to embark soon. Talking about leadership, I will be the team leader of a review that is looking at the UN's humanitarian response to the Tigray crisis in Ethiopia.
Maybe a short summary about what the situation is about for some of the listeners who are not familiar with the situation. Could you do that?
Yeah, sure.
So what happened?
So what happened was actually about, this was November 2020, so a little bit more now than 2 years ago. when conflict erupted in the northern part of Ethiopia, which is called Tigray, where the Tigrayan forces, they had created an opposition force, including a military force. The idea was for them, of course, to create an independent part called Tigray in the north of Ethiopia. Because of fundamental disagreements with the Ethiopian government. The Ethiopian government retaliated, and in fact has since been bombing and attacking villages and citizens and so on. So many of the rules that are part of international humanitarian law or human rights law have been violated. Then, if you take the classic view, you will say, well, both parties did that. And that's exactly what we have seen some of the UN agencies saying. Both parties have been guilty of war crimes and so on. In reality, in fact, and there's evidence also created on the human rights side, where in fact there's very significant evidence that the Ethiopian government committed serious crimes of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So clearly, then, from a humanitarian point of view, this raises a huge dilemma in terms of what are your actions, in terms of your relevance. Are you still continuing to provide food, or are you also trying really to call for an end to impunity? And so, in fact, prosecution of those committing war crimes as such. So clearly, that creates all sorts of very difficult dilemmas as such. But this is exactly also what this evaluation that I will lead in the coming months will be looking at. And I have to begin this journey, as it were, this exercise with the UN agencies. But the question I'm sure that will come on my desk is exactly, so is it better to keep quiet in order to remain present on the ground or to try to have access to northern Ethiopia, the Tigray area, and so work with the Ethiopian government? Or is it much better to be outspoken, an activist and say, what the Ethiopian government is doing violates international law, and so on. And clearly, this was a major question for the UN, and it maybe still is, although at the moment is at least the beginning of a peace agreement, which of course is good news. But I do know that there certainly was a major question in the UN for many, many months in the last 2 years. That question, the answer to that question, will probably have to be answered also by the review team, so to speak, that I will lead in terms of, so what should the agencies have done, if you see what I mean. Obviously, the review will review what did the agencies do, but we also will need to come up with an assessment, so what should they have been doing. And so, linking this to the previous conversation, I will certainly not hold back. I will certainly push them, the UN, and so on. And yes, this has been done in previous cases where, reports have been written on the silence of the UN, leading to unacceptable situations. As I said, there is some concern on the part of me that, in fact, we may find a similar situation in Ethiopia, where in which the UN should have done more. I don't know. We'll see. But at least I will ask the UN these questions very forcefully. And in the evaluation, we will push this issue. We'll make it a very prominent one. So that is my immediate response, because it relates very much to this idea, of advancing a rights agenda.
No, thanks, Ed. And my quick reaction, and although I try to put the emphasis in this conversation always on listening, because what I realize is, and the listeners who have been with me from the beginning, is that I realized quite quickly in the initial conversations that I had that I was not as good as listener as I thought I was, and that had to do with when I was starting to edit the podcast, I was like, oh, this person has said this. Because I was, very often busy with my reaction already, and then, not listening until the end because I had my answer. So I still have that in the conversation. So that's my, my challenge that I have often, because I am also from the Netherlands. So, I very quickly my opinion ready. But for me, I have to often to say, okay, calm down, listen, and digest that information, and then you can still give your opinion.
And what is interesting in that, Maurice?
Yeah.
Because obviously I completely agree with this. In relation to what I just said on this work that I'm going to do, what I will be most outspoken on will exactly relate to to the listening that you are emphasizing is so important. What I will ask from organizations, from UN agencies, why did they decide to do what they did? So, which may be even more important necessarily than what they did. The question is, in that making that decision, and there I will have to listen very carefully in terms of what was their decision-making process. For instance, in terms of speaking out on the behavior of the Ethiopian government or the Ethiopian military, if you see what I mean. Maybe, it was better to stay silent. I don't know. But I want to hear from them why they took that decision then, if you see what I mean. And that required, so it's not so much for me to be critical just on that silence. It's much more, did they actually, maybe they had a very good reason, but I want to know really from them what it is, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I will be following you, and it will be, this is important stuff. So all the best with this assignment. We're slowly coming to the end of our conversation. I have a couple of quick questions for you. The first one is, music is very important to me. So I always ask my guests to share with me a piece of music or a song that best embodies who you are and why.
Well, yeah, and this, it's a great question, Maurice, because I'm very fond of all sorts of music. And especially, of course, coming towards the end of the year, there's always these lists, right? You start to make your favorite list for the year or even of all times. And, what is the best song or your most, exactly the song you favor most. And that really changes from day to day, in my case. But then I thought, since it had sort of to reflect a little bit what we have been talking about, and actually also relates to what I did looking back at the year. So each time the Rolling Stones go on tour, you think it's the last time, right? These guys are late 70s. Keith Richards, I think, is 80. So, yes, I did take the opportunity to go and see them again. I think it was the hottest day of the year in France. Seriously, it was 40 degrees Celsius in the stadium. And Mick was jumping around, seriously, like he was a 20-year-old something. So extremely impressive, I must say. But then, in fact, so probably my most favorite Rolling Stones song is Gimme Shelter, which they didn't play. Fortunately, I'd seen them before.
Yeah.
Other years and so on. So I've seen them play live Gimme Shelter. But Gimme Shelter is such an important song for various reasons. Obviously, there's the context of the Vietnam War, very much. But in fact, it wasn't only about that, from what I know. The song is also about rape, in fact, which also comes up in the lyrics and so on. So it's also about some of the personal circumstances as such, or what was certainly on their minds when they wrote that song. But then, of course, at the end of the song, what is really so important is, it ends on a positive note. Instead of it's a shot away, it's a kiss away, right? So you can turn it into love. And that's really why I like Gimme Shelter so much. And also, I think in the context, I I heard it several days in a row, particularly this year in February when the Ukraine, the Russian aggression against Ukraine really escalated, so to speak. On various radio stations, Give Me Shelter was played. So also in that context, for this year, Give Me Shelter, and for this podcast, Give Me Shelter, would definitely be my favorite song, Maurice.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks. And that song will be added to the Spotify playlist that I established. So, all the songs that are picked by my guests, you can listen to that. And it's very eclectic list, as you can imagine, from classical to hard rock. But it's cool. I like listening to it because it, brings me back to the conversation that I've had. Your question for my next guest.
Well, that then actually also relates to the fact that we are now into December, end of year, and then in fact, you start, as I said, one reflects on, the 12 months sort of behind you. But of course, you're also thinking, what is it? I mean, whether it's good New Year resolutions or just intentions for the next year. So I'm not sure when exactly you will do your next podcast, but I presume, it might be still December or, in fact, already into the next year. I would like to ask the next person who comes after me really to reflect on, his or her aspirations or wishes for the new year.
Great. I like that. Any last message, invitation, or question for the listeners before we close?
So this podcast is not only about my professional career and what I have done and achieved. I think it certainly covers some of the things that drive me and that inspire me. A lot of what I do and work on has to do with inequality and justice, and particularly with ending that in terms of, holding governments, holding organizations, institutions to account for their roles and responsibilities as such. So, because that idea of accountability, the way in which organizations or people use the responsibilities that are entrusted to them, is really close to my heart. I hope you find it inspiring, and I wish you a lot of pleasure in listening to it.
No, thanks, Ed. And I definitely enjoyed it a lot. I'm sure the listeners, will as well. So thank you so much, and good luck with everything you do, and especially with this upcoming review.
Thanks, Maurice. Appreciate it enormously. I'm sure we'll stay in touch. And all the best to you and your work. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.